Driving rideshare was never my dream, but it paid the bills. Nights were my best shift. Fewer cars on the road, more space to think. And that Friday started like any other, so midnight pickups from the usual crowd, tipsy college kids smelling of cheap vodka, bar regulars slurring out street names, couples whispering in the back seat. It's disgusting. So the request for Hillary came at 1:45 a.m. The pickup location was an intersection near the hospital, just a block from one of the rowdiest bars in town. The street was nearly empty when I arrived. Storefronts sat dark behind locked doors. The only sound was the distant bass from the bar down the road. No one stood waiting. I sent the arrival message and scanned the shadows. That's when my rear door opened. She slid in, mid-30s maybe, pale with limp blonde hair hanging over her shoulders. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical. She closed the door without a word. Her destination was in the east side suburbs. I confirmed it. A small nod was her only answer. But I kept talking, but she didn't talk back. And after a while, I finally had no choice but to shut up. So we drove in silence, like literal silence. I don't know why, but I started to feel so weird. I watched her in the rear view from time to time. She kept her head turned toward the window, expression unreadable, and her eyes following the blur of passing buildings. There was a thin plastic hospital wristband circled in her arm. The roads thinned as we crossed into quieter neighborhoods. Street lamps grew sparser, their glow spilling only into small circles on the pavement. The silence in the car became something more than awkward. It was oppressive, a weight that made my chest feel tight. The address she'd given me led to an old house that had probably seen some better days, and I pulled to a stop in front of it. The lights were off, but I could see a pickup truck out front, telling me that somebody was home. And when I glanced back, the seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. The air still carried the faint scent of her, a sterile tang like antiseptic. I paused, scanning my back seat, and even checking the floor, just in case she'd randomly decided to get down there for some stupid reason. The Rideshare app showed no record of a trip for Hillary. My status was offline. It was like she'd never even been there. Before I could process it, a sound carried through the night. Faint, muffled screaming from the dark house ahead. I froze. My eyes stayed fixed on the empty windows. It was faint. Distant even. Definitely coming from the house I'd just dropped my ghost off at. I looked over at the house. The lights were still dark, and I caught myself wondering if I was imagining the screaming, since someone inside the house would need to be screaming pretty loud in order for me to hear them. And that's when I heard the gunshot. To be honest, I saw the gunshot. I saw the flash of light in the window as someone in that house started shooting. And immediately I realized that something very horrible was going on. I was out of the car before my mind caught up. The front door of the house was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled stale, like dust and something faintly metallic. The moment I made it through that door, something dropped off the second floor in front of me, hitting the hardwood floor before me with a heavy thud. And it took me a moment to realize that it was a person. A man, mid-40s, groaned in pain as he writhed on the hardwood. That's when I noticed a gun on the ground beside him. It was out of his reach, but it was just beside my shoe. I could have kicked it over to him. Instead, I watched him drag himself toward it before my eyes shifted up toward a shape on the stairs. And when I was about to run for my life, a shape moved at the top of the stairs. It was Hillary! Her eyes locked onto mine. No expression, No sound. The man on the floor noticed me, reaching toward the gun. His fingers strained for it, and then stopped. Then suddenly something unseen grabbed him. His body jerked violently as if hooked by an invisible force, and he slid backward into the shadows of the hallway, screaming until the sound was cut off. But Hillary didn't move. She kept staring, her face as pale and still as when she'd sat in my back seat. I stepped back, then turned and left. My body moved fast, but my thoughts were lagging, heavy with disbelief. The cold air outside hit like a shock. I got into my car, started the engine, and didn't stop driving until the house was long behind me. And the next day, the local news reported a tragedy. A man had taken his own life after his wife had died in the hospital earlier that evening. They mentioned an ongoing investigation into domestic abuse allegations. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. If I had, they wouldn't have believed me. If you ever find yourself alone in the back of a car late at night, remember, not every ride ends where it's supposed to. Some passengers never leave. So before your next trip takes a turn, you can't come back from, comment and share this so you're not the only one who knows. And subscribe before midnight, because you never know who might be waiting in the back seat. It was close to 3 a.m., the kind of hour where the world feels hollow, and I decided this would be my last ride before calling it a night. The roads were empty, the air was sharp with that pre-dawn chill, and I was already picturing my bed. The pickup location was a gas station just off the highway. Isolated. Quiet. I pulled in under the buzzing fluorescent canopy, my headlights washing over rows of empty pumps. He was already there. A short man in a dark hoodie, hood up, face in shadow. He stood perfectly still, not leaning, not shifting his weight, just standing beneath the flickering light like he'd been waiting for hours. He opened the rear door without a word and slid into the back seat. The smell hit me first, faint, like damp concrete, as if he'd been standing in a basement all night. I confirmed the address on my phone, a residential street about 15 minutes away. He gave a small nod, the kind that barely moves the head. Some people are like this, and it always makes me feel pissed. We pulled away from the gas station, and you know what? The silence was thick between us. The drive was uneventful at first. My headlights cut through long stretches of empty road, street lamps spaced too far apart, shadows stretching in every direction. In the mirror, I could see him. He didn't look out the windows, didn't touch his phone. His head was tilted slightly down, his hands resting perfectly still in his lap. No fidgeting, no shifting, just stillness. And halfway there, his voice broke the silence. That's the wrong address. Not angry, not confused. The words were flat, just stating a fact. I glanced at the GPS. This is the one you entered? And that's when he said, "Not anymore." He gave me a new address, not far in a straight line, but the route wound through unfamiliar parts of town. 20 extra minutes, maybe more. The streets grew narrower, older, the houses closer together, their windows dark. As we turned off the main road, the quiet deepened. No cars, no signs of life. Just the low hum of the engine and the occasional groan of my tires over uneven asphalt. The destination appeared on the map. A sagging 2-story house set back from the street. The paint had peeled away years ago. One of the upstairs windows was boarded over. The lawn was waist-high with weeds, and a chain-link fence leaned drunkenly toward the sidewalk. No lights were on. Then I stopped at the curb, my tires crunching over bits of broken glass. But he didn't move. I told him that we had reached his location. For a moment, I thought maybe he'd changed his mind, but then he exhaled. Slow and deliberate, almost a sigh. He opened the door and stepped out into the darkness. I watched him walk toward the house. His movements were unhurried, his back straight, his head never turning. At the edge of the overgrown lawn, he vanished between two tall, untidy bushes without looking back. I just sat there a second longer than I should have, unsettled by how easily the darkness had swallowed him. Finally, I reached for my phone to end the ride. And that's when I froze. There was no active trip. The app showed me as offline, the status bar quietly glowing red. The trip history said my last ride had ended 30 minutes ago, before I'd even reached the first address. The timestamp made no sense. I stared at the screen, half expecting the ride to reappear, but it didn't. There was no record of a passenger. No record of the trip. I then drove home with the radio off, every small creak of the car making my shoulders tense. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe the app had glitched. Maybe the trip had been canceled mid-drive. But none of that explained why I'd still taken him to the second address, or why I had. I told myself to forget it. I even managed to. For about 2 days. That's when I saw the news. An abandoned house in that same neighborhood had burned down. The fire started in the early hours of the morning. Inside, they found human remains. The man had been missing for over a year. The strange part was what the witnesses claimed. A few neighbors swore they'd seen someone drop the man off that night. They'd noticed because it was unusual to see a car on that street so late. But when investigators pulled the security footage from nearby intersections, there was nothing. No headlights, no car, no driver. Just a man in a dark hoodie walking alone down the street, disappearing between the bushes. Winter nights in the city have a certain stillness to them. Not the soft, comforting kind. The kind that feels hollow, like the world has stopped breathing. The rail yards are the worst for it. No voices, no footsteps. Just the metallic groan of distant tracks, cooling in the cold. It was just before midnight when the request came in. Pick up. The central station. Not unusual for that hour. Plenty of people missed the last train and had to find another way home. I pulled up to the pickup point, a strip of cracked pavement lit by a single flickering lamp. The place looked deserted, but then I saw him. He was standing near an old bench, the kind that's been at the station since the 70s, its paint flaking into rust. He wore a long, dark coat that brushed against his shoes, and a black hat pulled low over his eyes. He didn't move until I rolled to a stop. Without a word, he opened the rear door and slid in. The address he gave was across town, far from the station. I put it into the GPS and pulled away, the heater's hum filling the silence. From the start, something felt off. He wasn't fidgeting like most passengers. No scrolling on his phone. No idle chatter. Just sitting with his hands resting neatly on his knees, head tilted slightly down. Every few minutes, I caught his gaze in the mirror. He wasn't glaring, more like he was studying me. The streets were nearly empty. Sodium lights washed the snow-dusted asphalt in dull orange as we passed under them. When we drove beneath one particularly bright lamp, his face was lit just enough for me to see it clearly. Pale. Not sickly pale. Unnaturally pale. Skin with no warmth to it. 10 minutes into the ride, he spoke for the first time. "You're going the wrong way." I glanced at the GPS. "This is the fastest route?" He didn't argue, just repeated, slower this time. "No. Take the old bridge." I froze for a moment. The old bridge wasn't on any route. In fact, it hadn't been open to traffic for years. Concrete cracked through to rusted rebar. Guardrails missing. The city had fenced it off a decade ago after deeming it unsafe. Cars weren't supposed to go over it anymore. But something in the way he said it, the certainty made my hands turn the wheel. The streets grew narrower as we approached the river. Streetlights became scarce until there were none at all, the only light coming from my headlights sweeping across the road. Then the bridge appeared. It looked worse than I remembered. Chunks of pavement gone entirely, leaving gaps where the black water shimmered below. The air here felt wrong, heavier, colder, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees the moment I drove onto it. We were halfway across when his voice came again, calm and steady. "Stop!" I slowed to a crawl and pulled over, though there was no shoulder to speak of, just cracked concrete and the drop to the river. He opened the door and stepped out. The wind cut through the silence, carrying the faint creak of metal. I watched as he walked toward the edge of the bridge. His steps were slow, deliberate. He didn't pause. One moment, there was solid ground under his feet. The next, there wasn't. No splash, no sound of impact. Just gone. For a long moment, I stayed there, staring at the spot where he'd vanished, my breath clouding in the frigid air. The river was black and still. My headlights illuminated nothing but empty space. Finally, I drove off, my hands tight on the wheel, eyes fixed dead ahead. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that pale face, the way he'd studied me in the mirror. Around 3 a.m., I gave in and searched online for the old bridge. The first result was an article from 30 years ago. A man had taken his own life there. Witnesses said he'd been running late for the last train out of the city. He'd missed it by minutes. Wearing a long coat and a black hat, he'd walked calmly to the middle of the bridge and stepped off without hesitation. The address he'd given me earlier? I looked it up. It wasn't a house. It was the location of the city cemetery, the section he would have been buried in. It was raining that night, the kind of steady, cold drizzle that turns a city into a smear of lights and reflections. My last ride came in just after 2 a.m., pick up at the edge of an old residential district. When I pulled up, she was already there. A woman, standing under a flickering street lamp, white dress clinging to her from the rain, long dark hair straight, plastered to her face. She wasn't holding a phone, but somehow she knew I was her ride. She got into the back without a word. Her dress made a faint, wet sound against the seat. The address she gave was across town, in a neighborhood I rarely drove to. A cluster of narrow, twisting streets with houses from the 1920s. We started moving. She didn't check her phone, didn't make small talk. She just stared straight ahead, hands folded neatly in her lap. Every so often, I'd catch her reflection in the rearview mirror, her eyes fixed on me, not hostile, but steady, unblinking. The roads were empty. The only sound was the wipers swiping back and forth. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed something strange. The temperature inside the car had dropped. The heater was on, but my breath was faintly visible. in the glow from the dashboard. I tried to focus on the road. The rain blurred the world into streaks of light. When we reached the neighborhood, the GPS said we were close. But as I slowed, I realized the street we were on wasn't quite right. The houses here looked abandoned, broken windows, peeling paint, weeds pushing through cracked pavement. I was about to ask her if she was sure about her location, and suddenly she spoke. Here. I pulled over in front of a sagging house with no lights. The front gate hung crooked, one hinge rusted through. She didn't get out right away. She just sat there for a moment, looking at the house. Then, without looking back at me, she opened the door and stepped into the rain. She didn't run, didn't fumble with the gate. She simply walked up the broken path, disappearing into the shadows of the porch. The porch light flickered once as she passed under it. Then darkness again. I ended the ride on the app. Or I tried to. Because there was nothing to end. No active trip. No fare. My dashboard showed I'd been offline for the past 20 minutes. Confused, I sat there a moment longer before driving off. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. So I searched the address. The house had been empty for over 30 years. And the last occupant was a young woman, killed in a hit and run, a block from home, while walking back from her wedding reception. She'd been wearing her wedding dress when they found her. And that case was never solved.